This week, Dana White went on Kamaru Usman and Henry Cejudo's new podcast and was quoted as saying that you cannot deny that Kamaru Usman is the greatest welterweight of all time. So a lot of fans had a reaction to that. Some agreed with the statement. Some thought there was no way Kamaru Usman was the welterweight GOAT. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to go through and do a tier list of my top 10 welterweights of all time. Let me know your guys' thoughts on this list. Obviously, there's going to be some disagreements in certain spots. So what guys do you think should be higher or lower? And let's just dive right into it. We're going to start off with my number one welterweight of all time. And for me, it's going to be George St. Pierre. And in my opinion, he is in a tier all by himself. So I do think he is the clear welterweight GOAT, even though Dana's going to go with Kamaru, the more recent champion. For me, it's GSP all the way. He has a 19-2 UFC record at 170 pounds. He is the second most wins all time at the welterweight division, only behind Neil Magny. And then the biggest and probably the most important stat here is that he has 12 title fight wins. He also went on a stretch where he won 33 consecutive rounds. So he has the duration being a champion. He also has just the dominance over that stretch. I mean, winning 33 rounds in a row, that would be more than 6 straight 5-round fights where you're just winning every single round. So even if he wasn't getting, a crazy amount of finishes during his title reign, the dominance was definitely there. And those title fights span from 2004 to 2013. So pretty much a 10-year stretch of him being at the top of the welterweight division. I also get the argument, for some of the newer champions, it's going to be tougher to put together a long reign because the overall competition has improved. But let's not act like the 170-pound division when GSP was champ was not good. It was a quality division for a very long time, and he has some very quality wins on his resume. He has 2 wins over BJ Penn, an all-time legend, 2 wins over Matt Hughes, someone we're definitely going to talk about in this video, 2 wins over Josh Koscheck, also has 1 win over guys like Nick Diaz, Carlos Condit, Johnny Hendricks. Even though that one was controversial, close decisions are going to happen. Jake Shields, Dan Hardy, Thiago Alves, John Fitch, Matt Serra, and Sean Shirk. So in my opinion, the level of competition was still very high in this era of the welterweight division. And if we were looking at the greatest fighters of all time and you kind of took steroids into account where you're going to penalize a guy like John Jones for popping, if steroids matter, I think George St. Pierre is the greatest fighter of all time. I think he's the GOAT. So that would also mean that he would have to be my welterweight GOAT. So GSP going to be in a tier by himself, in my opinion. Now shifting into tier 2, we're going to have 2 welterweights. It's going to be Kamaru Usman as my number 2 welterweight, and then Matt Hughes at number 3. And statistically, I feel like Matt Hughes is kind of like the forgotten man in this argument, but statistically, he actually has the better resume just in terms of the number of title wins that he actually has. But I do think it's important to compare eras, and Kamaru Usman's 6 title wins, in my opinion, is more impressive than the quality of competition that Matt Hughes faced in his 9 title wins. So starting off with Kamaru Usman, 2 wins over Colby Covington, 2 wins over Jorge Masvidal, and then took the belt off of Tyron Woodley and then also defended the belt against Gilbert Burns. So those are some quality wins right there. Pre-title win, he has wins over Leon Edwards, Rafael Dos Anjos, Damian Maia, and Sean Strickland. So also some solid wins leading up to the belt. At this point, it does seem unlikely that Kamaru Usman gets back to the belt, but if he does, it could even bolster his resume even more. Do I think he's going to get back to the belt and stack up enough wins to top GSP? Probably not, but who knows? He's one of the best of all time in this division. So top 2 welterweight of all time, in my opinion. And then the number 3 for me, Matt Hughes, 9 title wins. That is 5th most all time, regardless of division. So Matt Hughes truly is an all-time great. He also has some strong quality wins, George St. Pierre, BJ Penn, Sean Shirk, Matt Serra. But then some of the other title fight wins looking a little shaky. 2 wins over Carlos Newton, a win over Hayato Sakurai, Gil Castillo, and then Hanato Verissimo. Those wins have not aged as well, right? Those guys were fighting for titles, but didn't really put together great resumes throughout the rest of their career. It was still very early on in the UFC, so he wasn't facing all elite competition in those title defenses, which is why I do have Matt Hughes below Kamaru Usman. Now we're going to shift into tier 3, and my number 4 welterweight of all time is going to be Leon Edwards, and I do think he's probably 1 or 2 more title wins away from jumping into that tier 2 territory with Kamaru Usman. and Matt Hughes. He has 3 current title wins, but those wins are against very impressive guys. 2 wins over Kamaru Usman and 1 over Colby Covington. I also think Leon has kind of an advantage here because he actually took the belt off an all-time great in Kamaru Usman, right? Like, no one took the belt off of GSP towards the end of his career. Leon Edwards was the guy that took Kamaru Usman out of his prime. Usman was rolling. He was even looking good in the fight where Leon ended up taking the belt. Leon knocks him out, then beats him again by decision. So I do think that kind of helps Leon's case here to put him at the number 4 welterweight of all time. He's 14-2 in the UFC, and then prior to winning the belt, he has quality wins over guys like RDA, Vicente Luque, Donald Cerrone, and Gunnar Nelson. So I do think 1 or 2 more wins, Leon Edwards definitely has an argument to be viewed as, 2 more wins, he might be the second best of all time. 1 more win, just jumping up into that tier and is in the conversation. And then my other tier 3 welterweight is going to be Tyron Woodley. And I think at this point, he's probably one of the more underrated legends. And I feel like it's just because we had a lot of new fans come in during the pandemic. And those newer fans pretty much only saw the complete fall off of Tyron Woodley when he was out of his prime. He had a very rough end to it, 4 straight losses to end his UFC run. And these were not close competitive losses. He was pretty much getting shut out in all of those matchups. So I think that's why people don't, view Tyron Woodley super highly. Also, you had the Jake Paul fights, which, isn't a great look, but prime Tyron Woodley was an absolute monster. He won the belt by KOing Robbie Lawler in the first round. He had a draw against Stephen Thompson and then won a majority decision. He defended it 2 more times against Damian Maia and Darren Till, completely stopped the hype train of Darren Till before he ended up losing the belt to Kamaru Usman. But he also has quality wins over Carlos Condit, Josh Koscheck, Kelvin Gastelum, and Paul Daly leading up to getting that title shot against Robbie Lawler. So definitely someone who I think is overlooked when we're talking about some of the best welterweights of all time, but definitely deserves to be in the top 10. Now, shifting into tier 4, these are going to be, number 6 through the rest of the top 10, plus 1 guy added in on the end because I couldn't decide. But the 6th best welterweight, I'm going to be going with Robbie Lawler. And it might seem low to have him here in tier 4 because he does have 3 title wins, which is going to be, at least 2 more than the rest of the guys in this list. But I think it's just due to the closeness of some of those title fight wins. He had wins over Josh Koscheck and Rory McDonald, which set him up for a title fight against Johnny Hendricks. He ended up losing that first title shot against Big Rig by unanimous decision, racked up 2 more wins against Jake Ellenberger and Matt Brown, set him up for another shot against Johnny Hendricks. He won that one by split decision. Now, I think most people thought that Johnny Hendricks won that fight. 12 of the 16 media members on MMA Decisions did score it for Big Rig, but he won the belt, and then he defended it in an absolute war against Rory McDonald. Super competitive fight, one of the more legendary fights in, MMA history. The fight where he's staring him down heading into the 5th round or at the end of the 4th, and then ends up finishing him in the 5th round where he probably did need a finish. So just a legendary moment for Robbie Lawler. And then his last title win came by split decision against Carlos Condit. 15 of the 20 media members on MMA Decisions did score the fight for Condit. So even though he had some close wins in title fights, they could have gone the other way. Still a legendary welterweight who just put on absolute wars against the top level of competition in his era. So after Robbie Lawler, going to be going with Johnny Hendricks. And Big Rig does kind of have a fairly controversial career because in his prime, the dude was a monster. He had a 12-second knockout of John Fitch, 46-second knockout of Martin Kampmann. He had the win over Carlos Condit, which set him up for the title shot. And then many believe that he actually beat George St. Pierre in GSP's last fight at welterweight, did not end up getting the nod on the scorecards, lost a split decision. But once GSP retired or, stepped away for a few years, he was matched up against Robbie Lawler for the vacant belt, won that one like I just mentioned, then it lost it right back to him by split decision. The problem here with Johnny Hendricks is that after the UFC introduced USADA, Johnny Hendricks pretty much fell apart. He ended his UFC run 1-5. He missed weight in 3 of those 6 fights, and that fight was just a few years after nearly beating the greatest of all time in George St. Pierre. So I guess it depends on how you factor in the USADA fall off. Does that, dock him a few spots for you? In my opinion, I think this number 7 spot is fair, but let me know what you guys think. And then the next welterweight, number 8 all time, is going to be Carlos Condit. He didn't have the greatest end to his UFC career, which is what some fans may remember, but in his prime, he was just super competitive with all the top guys. He has finishes over Rory McDonald, Dan Hardy, Martin Kampmann. He has an interim title win over Nick Diaz, so didn't get undisputed, but has the interim title win. He did lose the GSP, as pretty much everyone of that era did, but he did drop him, so he at least had a moment in that matchup. 4 years after losing to George St. Pierre, he got his final title shot against Robbie Lawler, which I already referenced, a pretty controversial split decision there, so he was pretty close to becoming undisputed. And I just think a lot of fighters in this era aren't going to have great title fight stats because they were just blocked by GSP, who had such a long reign. This is a very quality division in terms of the guys who have become champion. Now, looking at my number 9, 10, and 11, I had a tough time kind of differentiating between these three in terms of how I was ranking them. There's arguments for each of these guys to be higher, but I'm going to go with Colby Covington at number 9, Matt Serra at number 10, and then Stephen Thompson at number 11. The reason why I have a tough time ranking Colby Covington is that I feel like part of the reason he's being bumped up here is because he's lost to some elite guys, which isn't a great way to get propelled. You don't want to be the guy that's almost beating the top guys but isn't racking up those big wins. But I mean, that's what he really has been throughout his career. He was very competitive in both the Kamaru-Usman matchups, and Usman, during his title reign had looked really dominant, pretty much except for those Colby matchups. Personally, I thought the last Usman fight was a draw, so I do think he is very competitive with those top guys. Obviously, the most recent fight against Leon is not great, but he could be out of his prime at this point. But outside of, being super competitive with Kamaru Usman, he doesn't have a ton of amazing wins outside of that. The names on his resume are top tier: Tyron Woodley, Robbie Lawler, RDA, Jorge Masvidal, Damian Maia. But you could make the argument that most, if not all of those guys were already out of their prime by the time Colby Covington beat them. I do think the interim title win against RDA helps, especially because he kind of got screwed out of unifying the belts, and he could have actually been the guy who took the belt off of Tyron Woodley, which would have been a huge bump to his legacy, and he probably would be viewed differently at this point in terms of, welterweight history. But I think number 9 is a fair spot. He's probably never going to get the undisputed title, but he has an interim title win and was very competitive against the top guys of the division. Next is going to be Matt Serra, like I said, my number 10, and he probably has the best win of all time in this division, knocking out GSP in the first round right after George St. Pierre finished Matt Hughes. So GSP with 2 losses in the UFC. The first one to Matt Hughes I don't think is quite as impressive, just because it was, I think farther away from GSP's prime than when Matt Serra knocked him out. Everyone thought GSP was just going to go on a complete title run. Matt Serra ended that. He was one of the biggest, if not the biggest underdog in UFC history. But outside of that win, the resume isn't great. He's a 500 fighter in the UFC, 7-7. He does have decent wins over Chris Lytle, Frank Trigg, and Yves Edwards, but he doesn't have the super well-rounded, profile compared to some of these other guys. So he has the best win. Does that bump him up, or are we viewing that as a little fluky? I don't know. I think the number 10 spot is a fair ranking here for Matt Serra. And then the final guy here, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. He never won a title, never won an interim title, but he was very, very close to being undisputed 2 different times. He got his title matchup against Tyron Woodley, had a draw in the first matchup, very, very close fight, and then a majority decision for Tyron Woodley in the rematch in another very close matchup. On MMA decisions, there were 6 media members who scored it for Wonderboy. There were 5 media members who scored it for Tyron Woodley, and then 8 scored it a draw. So it really could have ended up being a draw in back-to-back fights. Didn't end up happening. Tyron Woodley got his hand raised. But even outside of those matchups where, he drew and lost a close one to Tyron Woodley, he has a nice resume outside of those matchups. Wins over Johnny Hendricks, Roy McDonald, Robert Whittaker, Vicente Luque, Jake Ellenberger, Jeff Neal, and then Kevin Holland. So he did rack up a ton of quality wins. Probably definitely out of his prime at this point, but I think he can still be competitive against some of the top guys in the division, especially depending on the matchup. So I think Wonderboy definitely does have an argument to be in the top 10, but that's going to wrap it up for my top 10 welterweights of all time. Even though Dana thinks Kamaru Usman's the GOAT, I think it's pretty clearly GSP. I'm going to stand on that hill. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with these rankings? How are we feeling about the list? Let me know down below. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.